parts of West and East Baltimore that existed under what feels like economic apartheid for decades, not just for one mayoral term or two mayoral terms. When you think about COVID-19 and what has taken what was a bleed almost to a full hemorrhage, what does that say to you about who's coming in as mayor and what they need to do now that is even more long-term thinking than perhaps it needed to be 3 months ago? When you talk about economic development in parts of the city that frankly have eluded almost every administration for the last 2 decades.
So what I like to say is we don't need to just invest in these areas. We need to over-invest in them. And I call it greenlining. Baltimore has a shameful history of redlining that has deprived many communities of investment over decades. I think we're going to have to overcompensate from that. And perhaps the economic fallout from the coronavirus gives us the opportunity to come back in a very intentional and equitable way to focus on those areas the most. I think that's the only answer to the history we have in this city, to more equitably drive investment across the city. I talk about reforming the mayor's office and bringing in a strong deputy mayor model. I want a deputy mayor for economic development to make this a front office priority for the mayor. But next to that deputy mayor, I want a deputy mayor for equity and inclusion, so that every decision we make about investment is looked at through that lens. We have not done that historically. So certain parts of the city have benefited, while others have just languished. We've got to have a much more intentional way of investing and looking at things from this equity lens.
Well, and you've had some level of experience with that in different parts of the country through your work with the federal government. But I'm curious. I mean, Baltimore has traditionally been a developer town. And in many cases, there's some believe that City Hall is driven by developers.
Yeah.
What has to change? Is it a new ecosystem of investors? Because you and I both know that everybody doesn't define growth the same way. And so the folks that want a certain level of return on investment from a Harbor East or a Fells Point or a Port Covington, are they not the same investors that you're looking for in different parts of the city? Talk to me a little bit about that, because that's what concerns me, and I think others, is that the model of investing and development in this city has been singly focused. How does that change to get done what you're talking about?
So, my background is in city planning and economic development. That's what I studied. I worked for years at the Urban Institute and then at T. Rowe Price and investing in cities across the country, and specifically in Baltimore. And looking at this city, I would say we have over-preferenced real estate development at the expense of job creation. We have given more incentives to put up buildings than we have to create jobs for people. That's what has to change in my mind. Because if we can raise income in the city of Baltimore with good jobs, if we can raise income, it will change so many dimensions of poverty in this city and structural racism.
If I can push you a little bit there, because I think this is an incredibly important point. Every space for new industry doesn't work in every city. And so as you think about cities that are comparable to Baltimore and areas that they've been able to push new industry growth, and you think about the talent pool of Baltimore and sometimes an ignored talent pool, are there areas that you currently think might be one of those areas for potential growth that we just don't hear many other people talking about?
Sure. I mean, when people look at Baltimore, they tend to talk about eds, meds, and techs, the educational facilities we have here, the medical facilities, and the technology. And under technology, I think most people would say cybersecurity is something that we should be the experts on, given our situation near the national security agencies. But there's room for more. I mean, I'm really interested in developing more green industries in Baltimore and thinking about the next generation of manufacturing that we can have in this city, light manufacturing that is developing jobs that are environmentally sustainable. People talk about urban agriculture as something that Baltimore should take a look at. There's so much room and so much creativity in the city to look at the industries where we have some expertise already, where we already have presence, but to build around them and to create some new kinds of opportunities.
Can you build on the point you just made? Because I think it's an incredibly important one. I mean, we're talking about what are alternate pathways for job readiness for students, but what about this huge potential labor force that is not high school age, that is anywhere between 22 years old and 40 years old, who want to work, but who may not have a degree, in some cases may not have a diploma, but are prepared for all kinds of cert opportunities or other training opportunities if they had, one, access to them, and two, that there was the capacity to really begin to make impact. How do you think about those kind of opportunities and that demographic in particular?
So I think about that all the time. We have a unemployment rate for Black males in Baltimore ages 16 to 24 that is 4 times the national average. That has to change. We have to connect that population with real jobs. I think that one area that I'm particularly interested in is giving jobs to people who have prison records. We have about 20,000 people leaving the prison system each year in Baltimore. We are providing jobs for hundreds of them, but not thousands of them. We have such an opportunity to connect these people with community, with family, and with jobs. We need to re-educate employers to be more open to accepting people who have a record. And that is happening in Baltimore. I'm pleased to see progress we're making there. We just need to do more. Again, coming back to workforce training, I meet too many people who say, I've got a dozen certificates from training programs, I've never gotten a job. That's telling me something is broken here.
And I want, because again, I think that there's some real specific issues within the African-American and poor communities as it relates to this point in particular. And I'd love to know your thoughts, because what I hear you talking about is a real comprehensive look at how we're doing investment and development. How does transportation play a role in that? Because when we're talking about access to employment, you and I both know that even in the county, there may be opportunities to work that folks in the city just can't get to. And so how does transportation play a role in activating new workforce, connecting people to jobs? What are some of the things that we need to see that aren't being done?
Yeah, I think our public transportation system is failing the city. I have said I would get behind the idea of a regional transportation authority for Baltimore to take back local control of public transportation. It is unusual for a state to run a public transit system in a city. And we have not built, obviously we didn't build the red line, the rail line that was under discussion, that was taken off the table. But we have not built a bus system that's working for this city. I've taken the bus around Baltimore. It is ridiculous how long it takes to get from point to point. And the level of stress it puts on people trying to get to work on time, trying to get their kids to school on time, and the lack of agency that it gives people when they don't have good transportation. 1/3 of our citizens do not have access to a car in Baltimore. We can do so much better with public transportation. So I've said I would like to create east-west bus corridors that are moving at much higher speed. I'd like to look at all the bus transit routes and look at the employment centers versus the housing location of people to see how can we make this work better. It is ridiculous that it takes as long as it does for people to get from point A to point B in Baltimore, full stop. We need to take much more local control of our public transportation system. There are studies that say this may be the single most important contributor to urban poverty.
go.